because it stopped recording because I had to go sign on and off. Okay. One of the unusual things about Purim is that it is possible to celebrate Purim on one of 2 days. The Megillat Esther, it talks about the fact that in Shushan Habirah, the capital city of Shushan, the struggle took longer, a day longer before they were finished with the struggle. And therefore, they celebrated Purim a day later, on the 15th. And so the rabbi said that any city that was a walled city, going back to the times of Joshua, I'll explain why that in a minute, celebrates Purim on the 15th of Adar. Any other city celebrates Purim on the 14th of Adar, under normal circumstances. So, for example, in Israel, if you live in Tel Aviv, you celebrate Purim on the 14th. If you live in Jerusalem, you celebrate Purim on the 15th. And it is possible to drive from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem and have 2 days of Purim if you really want to. All right. Why this strange idea that it has to be a walled city going back to the time of Joshua is because at the time of Purim, the city of Jerusalem did not have a wall. It had been torn down by the Babylonians. It had not yet been reestablished. And therefore, to give honor to Jerusalem, that it should have the same status as some of these other cities, the rabbi said if it was a walled city going back to the times of Joshua, which the city of Jerusalem was, then they would read it on the 15th. Now, the exception to that rule is like this year. This year, Purim falls on Friday, and on Shabbos is the 15th. So those who lived in walled cities will read the Megillat Esther and celebrate Purim on the 14th like we do.
Okay, so when Purim's on Shabbos, there's an exception to the exception to the exception.
Something like that.
Okay.
Well, we don't celebrate Purim on Shabbat. Okay, so either it's, and so if Purim falls on Shabbat, it is moved.
So when is this year?
This year it's Thursday night, Friday. Now, what is a problem when it comes like that for us is the Sudat Purim, the Purim Suda, shouldn't be too close to Shabbat. So you should have it around noontime, earlier in the day, so that you don't go start Shabbos having a great big meal. And what we're going to do is we're going to have around noontime a nice big Purim Suda, and we'll have a lighter Shabbos dinner. So we can have both properly, celebrated. Okay.
Rabbi, but we would celebrate Purim anyways on the 14th because we weren't a walled city. I mean, I don't even think we were a city.
No, we were not. And
yeah,
the only walled cities that are that old would be somewhere in the Middle East. Jerusalem, according to many, Tiberias, what's it in English? Tiberias, Tzfat are considered to be ancient city. Damascus, the old parts of Damascus might date back to then, etc. Okay, so no, but here in North America, we're always going to have Purim on the 14th of Adar. All right, so the central story of Purim is found in Megillat Esther, the book of Esther. And all of the observances are derived from Megillat Esther. And there are certain very strange anomalies that are found in Megillat Esther, the book of Esther. The very first one that people know about is how many times is the name of God mentioned in the book of Esther? Any guesses?
0.
0. Okay, somebody did homework. Okay. Nowhere in the book of Esther is God's name mentioned, even when it would clearly be the right place for it to be mentioned. They don't say anything about praying to God for deliverance. Talk about fasting, talk about taking up arms, but nowhere does it come up forward with God's name. there are different opinions as to why. Some say because it was written as a letter originally and people were afraid that it would get torn up and they didn't want to have God's name torn up. Others suggest that the whole Purim Megillah is really a kind of not satirical, but parody in many ways, not to be taken seriously, because there are lots of problems, historical problems. The very first problem is that we know in Persian law, the queen could only come from certain families. There's no way that they would have allowed a unknown person to become queen. Maybe a concubine, but certainly not queen. And there's a lot of exaggerations and things that are to be found in Megillat Esther. So I'm going to go through it and we'll see some of these things. Some of the names I'm going to use the Hebrew pronunciation because the English is so hard. Ahasuerus is easier to say than Ahasuerus. Artaxerxes. Okay. Or Xerxes. Okay, so it begins this way. It happened in the days of Ahasuerus, that Ahasuerus, who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. In those days, when King Ahasuerus occupied the royal throne in the fortress Shushan, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all the officials and courtiers, the administrators of Persia and Media, the nobles and the governors of the provinces in his service. For no fewer than 180 days, he displayed the vast riches of his kingdom and the splendid glory of his majesty. Okay, so he spends a long time celebrating his position. The rabbis explain it because it was only at this point that he was totally secure as the king. At the end of this period, the king gave a banquet for 7 days in the court of the king's palace garden for all the people who lived in the fortress Shushan, high and low alike. There were hangings of white cotton and blue wool caught up by cords of fine linen and purple wool to silver rods and alabaster columns. And there were couches of gold and silver on a pavement of marble, alabaster, mother of pearl, and mosaics. Okay, so it describes all of the decorations. And this is in keeping with that ancient world's kind of thing. The drinking ware was golden beakers of various designs, and royal wine in abundance as befits a king. And the rule for the drinking was no restrictions. For the king had given orders to every palace steward to comply with each man's wishes. Now, the Greek historian Herodotus records that Persians were great drinkers, and their festive occasions were generally male only. They were segregated, and the Persians would drink enormous amounts of wine and other kinds of liquor. All right, so while the king is having this big 7-day celebration after all the 180-day celebration, this goes on to say, in addition, Queen Vashti gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of King Ahasuerus. Like I said, this is in keeping with Persian tradition, that the women did not come to the banquets with the men. On the 7th day, when the king was merry with wine, obviously he's drunk, he ordered Mechuman, Bizeta, Charvana, Bigta, Avgata, Zeter, Karkas, the 7 eunuchs in attendance on King Ahasuerus. These are all real Persian names. There are a lot of Persian loan words found in the book of Esther. While the book of Esther, Megillat Esther, is written in Hebrew, there are lots of Persian names. So now back to the story. So he tells these courtiers, by the way, the word eunuch may be descriptive physically. They may indeed have been eunuchs, but most likely, because eunuchs often served as officials, the word eunuch becomes associated with an official. And it does not mean that they were actually physically eunuchs, because we'll see some of the other characters are also called Sarisim, eunuchs, and they have families. So it doesn't seem likely that it means an actual eunuch. Okay, so what happens? It says to bring Queen Vashti before the king wearing a royal diadem to display her beauty to the peoples and the officials, for she was a beautiful woman. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command conveyed by the eunuchs. The king was greatly incensed and his fury burned within him. The straightforward reading is King Ahasuerus sends for his wife because she's a beautiful woman. He wants to show her off, and she's too proud to do it. And the king gets upset. All right. The rabbis, though, as in the way of the Midrash, try and see a lot more here. First of all, we got to get, because of the storyline, we have to get Vashti out of the way. Esther can't become queen if Vashti is queen, so we got to get rid of her. And if she's a nice girl, a nice woman, it's not really fair for her to suffer just so that Esther can become the queen. So the rabbis say that Vashti was not nice. She was, as a matter of fact, a very mean woman. And she used to have the Israelite girls come and serve her naked. And she used to bathe in Israelite virgin's blood. Okay? And so we see already how terrible she was. Oh, good. All right. So, every once in a while, move some of your hands or fingers, because then I know you're still there because we're not in the way. Okay. Because you got frozen again for a moment. All right. So Vashti, now, since she's a wicked woman, she would have no concern about appearing naked in front of other people. Notice what King Ahasuerus says. He says to her to come wearing a royal diadem, the royal crown. He doesn't say anything about what clothes she should wear. So the rabbi said that means he wanted her to come naked. Now, Vashti, being a vain woman, she had no problems with that, coming naked in front of all these men. But in order to get rid of her, God made her grow a monkey's tail all of a sudden. So here she is, a beautiful woman with this monkey's tail, and she's embarrassed to appear naked in front of all these men. Therefore, she refuses to come. Or you can just read it straightforward. She didn't want to show up. Okay. So now the king, after this episode, he's drunk. He's got his fawners around him. And king consulted the sages learned in procedure, for it was royal practice to turn to all who were versed in law and precedent. His closest advisors were Karkashetar, we'll skip their names, the 7 ministers of Persia and Media who had access to the royal presence and occupied the first place in the kingdom. What he asked shall be done according to law to Queen Vashti for failing to obey the command of King Ahasuerus conveyed by the eunuchs. What should I do with this woman? She's rebellious. Therefore, Memucan declared in the presence of the king and the ministers, Queen Vashti has committed an offense not only against your majesty, but also against all the officials and against all the peoples and all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will make all wives despise their husbands, as they reflect that King Ahasuerus himself ordered Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come. This very day, the ladies of Persia and Media, who have heard of the queen's behavior, will cite it to all your majesty's officials, and there'll be no end of scorn and provocation. All the women in Persia are going to get uppity, and they're going to tell their husbands, I'm not going to do what you tell me to do, because Queen Vashti refused to do what her husband Ahasuerus told her to do. So already, right now, you already see some of the absurdity, some of the over the top of the storytelling that we're having in this book of Esther, Queen Esther's story, okay? Megillat Esther. And we'll see about more of that in just a moment. Ahasuerus there are different opinions. Ahasuerus merely kind of a foolish man? Is he an evil man? Is he a nice man? You have to decide for yourself.
Rabbi,
Yes.
can I interrupt you and ask a question?
Of course.
If there's so much question in regards to whether or not the story is true, and it kind of is comical and this and that, why include it? What's the purpose?
Well, that's a good question. Now, the rabbis, we know, let me a little historical bit. We know that amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls, every book of the Jewish Bible, the Tanakh, was found except for Megillat Esther. It was missing. There was some discussion amongst the rabbis about Megillat Esther. But because the basic story is Israel is saved from this bad guy, it becomes a paradigm for future savings. And it serves, in a sense, the holiday of Purim was celebrated by different people for various things in their own lives. As a matter of fact, when I was in the university, one of my classmates, his father, you guys probably never heard of this, there was a terrorist who went after a building with officials of Jewish agencies in New York, and his father was one of the people who were trapped there originally. And so every year on the anniversary of he making it out alive without any problems, they had their own kind of a Purim. They would celebrate the hidden hand of God. Because the one thing we do know of Megillat Esther is it's all about the hidden hand of God. Nothing says God does this. And as a matter of fact, there's a very interesting, I mentioned the fact that Esther also sounds like Ishtar, the goddess of love. Esther also sounds like Hester Panim, the hidden face. The God's face is hidden in the story. And by the way, Martin Luther did not like the book of Esther. He couldn't understand why it was in the Bible, but that's his issue. Okay.
He was also very anti-Semitic. I read that recently.
Yeah, well, originally he
Very.
thought that when he made his changes and his reforms in the Catholic Church, all of the Jews would all convert to his Christianity, and he was very disappointed that didn't happen. But anyway, if you go to Orthodox circles, in general, they're going to tell you, they accept it on face value. This is what happened. Some scholars are willing to say, you know what, maybe something happened, but this is above reality. But it does have a lot of elements that fit into the time period, a lot of Persian loanwords, lots of details that fit into the ancient world of that time. So its exact origins, if you're interested in it, all kinds of things written about it and back and forth. Okay, so getting back to it. So Memuchan says, if it please your majesty, let a royal edict be issued by you and let it be written into the laws of Persia and Media so that it cannot be abrogated. That's another thing that we'll find here, that this idea that when the king passes a law, it can never be changed. That Vashti shall never enter the presence of King Ahasuerus, and let your majesty bestow a royal estate upon another who is more worthy than she. Then will the judgment executed by your majesty resound throughout your realm, vast though it is, and all the wives will treat their husbands with respect, high and low alike. You can't read this without having a little bit of a grin if you really understand it, okay? It doesn't say he kills her, but the rabbi said he did, but she's maybe just exiled, we don't know. The proposal was approved by the king and ministers, and the king did as Memuchan proposed. Dispatches were sent to all the provinces of the king, to every province in its own script, to every nation in its own language, that every man should wield authority in his home and speak the language of his own people. Okay, so they send out not only making sure that the wives listen to their husbands, but the wives had to speak the same language as their husband spoke. All right, this is could have been written by somebody, a woman's lib who wants to poke fun at what the ancient world looked like in some ways. Okay. Sometime afterwards, when the anger of King Ahasuerus subsided, he thought of Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. The king's servants who attended him said, let beautiful young virgins be sought out for your majesty. Your majesty appoint officers in every province of your realm to assemble all the beautiful young virgins in the fortress of Shushan, in the harem under the supervision of Haggai, the king's eunuch, guardian of the women. He probably was a eunuch. Let them be provided with their cosmetics and let the maiden who pleases your majesty be queen instead of Vashti. The proposal pleased the king, and he acted upon it. Okay, so the king's going to have a beauty pageant to find the replacement for Vashti. That's a great way to decide who should be queen of the kingdom. Now we are introduced to the hero and heroine. Traditionally, when this is read in the synagogue, it's a little read a little bit differently here. But in any case, in the fortress Shushan lived a Jew by the name of Mordechai, son of Yair, son of Shimi, son of Kish, a Benjaminite, who had been exiled from Jerusalem in the group that was carried into exile along with King Jeconiah of Judah, which had been driven into exile by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. Right, so Mordechai is identified, several names in his lineage. Again, in that period of time, even up until close to modern era, Jews were known to remember their ancestors, their lineage for generations and generations going back. People could go back 10, 12 generations with where they came from. His father was his father was his father was his father, etc. So that's unusual. He's called a Benjaminite, but yet he's listed with the people who came from Judah, which could be, because when the other tribes are lost, that doesn't mean everybody disappeared. It could have really been from the tribe of Benjamin. Also, but it sounds like he wants him to be one of the exiles, which would make him a very old man at this point, if the lineage is exactly that. Furthermore, in the line of, is said he's the son of Shimi, son of Kish. Now, you may not recognize the name Kish, but Kish is the father of Saul, who became the king. So it could be that Mordechai was related to the Kish, which means he was a relative of Saul, not a descendant of King Saul, but a relative of King Saul. We'll come back to that in a couple of minutes when we come to the villain. Okay, so put that in the back of your minds, that Mordechai is a descendant of the family of King Saul. Okay. He was foster father to Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The maiden was shapely and beautiful, and when her father and mother died, Mordechai adopted her as his own daughter. So Mordechai is a bit older than she is. There's a whole discussion in the rabbis whether or not he actually married her. We won't go into that, but she's identified as being a very beautiful woman. When the king's order and edict was proclaimed, and when many girls were assembled in the fortress Shushan under the supervision of Haggai, Esther too was taken into the king's palace under the supervision of Haggai, guardian of the women. Okay, so she gets called up. Of course, she's a beautiful woman. The girl pleased him and won his favor, and he hastened to furnish her with her cosmetics and her rations, as well as with the 7 maids who were due from the king's palace. And he treated her and her maids with special kindness in the harem. For Esther did not reveal her people or her kindred, for Mordechai had told her not to reveal it. So Esther doesn't say where she came from, what her lineage is, or anything. So nobody knows who she really is. Nobody knows that she's Jewish. Every single day, Mordechai would walk about in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was faring and what was happening to her. Apparently, Mordechai was something of an official in the government, so he had access to certain areas of the royal palace. And now comes a little sex. When each girl's turn came to go to King Ahasuerus at the end of 12 months treatment prescribed for women, for that was the period spent on beautifying them, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with perfumes. And they spent 6 months, 12 months at the spa, getting ready for the king and the women's cosmetics. And it was after that the girl would go to the king. Okay, after the 12-year period, he would go to the king. Whatever she asked for would be given to her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. She would go in the evening, fatal, a pause, and leave in the morning for second harem in charge of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch, guardian of the concubines. She would not go again to the king unless the king wanted her, and then she would be summoned by name. Okay, so King Ahasuerus had her for one night. She goes to another special harem, and she only comes back to the king if he requests her specifically by name. You know what? I enjoyed this. So-and-so came in on the 21st of October. I'd like to see her again tonight. Right? Otherwise, she didn't come to see him. Okay. When the turn came for Esther, daughter of Abichai, the uncle of Mordechai, who had adopted her as his own daughter, to go to the king, she did not ask for anything but what Haggai, the king's eunuch, guardian of the women, advised. Yet Esther won the admiration of all who saw her. Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus in his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tevet, in the 7th year of his reign. So we're told it was the 7th year of the king's reign. The king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she won his grace and favor more than all the virgins. So he set a royal diadem upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Okay, so she won the beauty contest. She won queen, not for a day, but queen forever, or unless the king got unhappy with her. So it goes. The king gave a great banquet for all his officials and courtiers, the banquet of Esther. He proclaimed a remission of taxes for the provinces and distributed gifts as befits a king. All right, so he celebrates, and he has a remission of taxes. But then what happens? When the virgins were assembled a second time, Mordechai said at the palace gate, wait a minute, didn't he just get married to Esther? So it seems he enjoyed the business of having all these different concubines come by and having different women that he could put to bed. So, it's a nice custom I've started. I'll keep doing it. According to the rabbis, he was trying to make Esther jealous so she would tell him what her ancestry was, so he could find out. But Esther still did not reveal her kindred or her people. See, because it says that right after that previous verse, that's why the rabbi said, obviously, Ahasuerus was trying to get Esther to reveal who she was. For Esther obeyed Mordechai's bidding, as she had done when she was under his tutelage. At that time, Mordechai was sitting in the palace gate. Bigtan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, two of his main bodyguards, became angry and plotted to do away with King Ahasuerus. Mordechai learned of it and told it to Queen Esther, and Esther reported it to the king in Mordechai's name. The matter was investigated and found to be so, and the two were impaled on stakes. This was recorded in the book of Annals at the instance of the king. Okay, so Mordechai uncovers a plot against Ahasuerus. He tells Esther, gets a message to Esther. Esther gets a message to King Ahasuerus telling him about the plot. The plot's investigated. The guys are executed, impaled on a stake. That's what we mean by hanging those days. They were executed, and then their bodies were put on display. It was written down in the king's annals, but there's no mention of a reward. Something is missing. How come Mordechai doesn't get a nice reward? Okay, so now nobody knows who Esther really is. Mordechai has saved the king. Esther is the queen. And Mordechai has not been rewarded. So all of these things are there. Chapter 3. Sometime afterward, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, son of Hamdata, the Agagite. Now, the custom on Purim is whenever we read the Megillat Esther, and whenever Haman's name is mentioned, we make noise, we pound our fists, we shake groggers, noisemakers, blow horns, everything, so the name of Haman would be blotted out. And no one will ever remember Haman because of that. So what do we Jews do? Every year we read about Haman so that we can blot out his memory and nobody will remember him. And next year we read about him again. Not makes much sense there, but yeah, so we drown out the name of Haman. He's called an Agagite. Now, in the book of Samuel, King Saul is supposed to destroy the Amalekites. And he has this big battle, defeats the Amalekites, but spares the life of the king of the Amalekites. And the king of the Amalekites, his name is Agag. So Megillat Esther implies that Haman is related or is a descendant of King Agag, who Saul was supposed to execute. Samuel comes along and gets rid of him, knocks him off. But according to the Midrash, in the meantime, before he's executed, he gets together with his wife, and because he got together with his wife, he was able to have children and since leading up to Haman. So this means if Mordechai is somehow related to King Saul through Saul's father Kish, and Haman is related to Agag, the king who was the enemy of Saul, that means there's an ancestral enmity between the families of Agag, Haman, and the family of King Saul, Mordechai. And it may be, as we'll call in a minute, that's why Mordechai refuses to bow down to Haman. So it goes on, because it says in the text, so the king advances this Haman and seated him higher than any of his fellow officials. All the king's courtiers in the palace gate knelt and bowed low to Haman, for such was the king's orders concerning him. But Mordechai would not kneel or bow down. Mordechai refuses. Now, a lot of people say Jews don't bow down to people. That's not true. If Jews didn't bow down to kings and emperors and all those things, there wouldn't be any Jews around today. Certainly Jews would bow down. So the rabbis want to say, why is it that Mordechai would not bow down to Haman? So one of the answers given was that Haman claimed he was a god, or he wore an idol around his neck, and if you bowed down to him, it looked like you were bowing to the idol, and Mordechai didn't want to do that. Or it could be that ancestral relationship between their families, that enmity. So anyway, so Mordechai wouldn't bow down. So then when the king's courtiers who were in the palace gate said to Mordechai, why do you disobey the king's order? When they spoke to him day after day and he would not listen to them, they told Haman in order to see whether Mordechai's resolve would prevail. For he explained to them that he was a Jew. This is one of the first times that the word Jew is used. All right? Yehudi, from Judah, but that's where the word Jew comes from. Yehudi. When Haman saw that Mordechai would not kneel or bow low to him, Haman was filled with rage. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordechai alone, having been told who Mordechai's people were. Haman plotted to do away with all the Jews, Mordechai's people throughout the kingdom of Hashverosh. So Haman's not going to take his vengeance just upon Mordechai. He wants to take his vengeance against every single Jew in the Persian Empire. That's why we read the book of Esther. Okay, in the first month, that is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of the king Ahasuerus, Pur, which means the lot, was cast before Haman concerning every day and every month, until it fell on the 12th month, that is the month of Adar. Haman then said to King Ahasuerus, there's a certain people scattered and dispersed among other peoples in all the provinces of your realm, whose laws are different from those of any other people, and who do not obey the king's laws. Now, this is a line that in Jewish history we find repeated, that Jews have their own customs, their own practices, which is true. And also the claim they don't follow the king's laws, which is not true. It depends. If religious law is an issue. But otherwise, Jews follow the laws, right? Just like anybody else did. But Haman says they have their own laws and they don't obey the king's laws. So they're not very nice, not very good. And it's not in your majesty's interest to tolerate them. If it please your majesty, let an edict be drawn for their destruction, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the stewards for deposit in the royal treasury. Haman's going to give the king a lot of money if he'll get rid of all of the Jews. The Persian version of the final solution. Thereupon the king removed his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, son of Hamdata the Agagite, the foe of the Jews. And the king said, the money and the people are yours to do with as you see fit. So the king says, do what you want. On the 13th day of the first month, 13th of Adar, scribes were summoned, and a decree was issued as Haman directed to the king's satraps, to the governors of every province, and to the officials of every people, to every province in its own script, to every people in its own language. The orders were issued in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed with the king's signet. Accordingly, written instructions were dispatched by couriers to all the king's provinces to destroy, massacre, and exterminate all the Jews, young and old, children and women, on a single day, on the 13th day of the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, and to plunder their possessions. Okay, so Haman has made a deal with the king. The king gives him the right. Not only that, he says, you can keep your money. And Haman sends out this order that they're to kill, massacre every single Jew, man, woman, and child, young and old, and to take their property. The text of the document was to the effect that a law should be proclaimed in every single province. It was to be publicly displayed to all the peoples, so that they would be ready for that day. The couriers went out post haste on the royal mission, and the decree was proclaimed in the fortress of Shushan. All right, so they issued this decree, this massacre that's going to take place in a little bit yet less than a year's time. And then what is the next line? The king and Haman sat down to feast. They put out this order to exterminate people. And after they send out the order, they sit down to eat a meal. But the city of Shushan was dumbfounded. The rest of the people around said, what's going on? But the king and Haman, they sit down for a meal. Okay? So now we've got the plot. Now we've got to have the save the day. Okay, so everything's in its place, and now we have to have the salvation come forward. When Mordecai learned all that had happened, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes. He went through the city crying out loudly and bitterly until he came to the front of the palace gate, for one could not enter the palace gate wearing sackcloth. Also, in every province that the king's command and decree had reached, there was a great mourning among the Jews with fasting, weeping, and wailing, and everybody lay in sackcloth and ashes. What's missing? Prayer to God. Save us. Any other book would have them, besides fasting, wearing sackcloth, says, please, God, save us. We sinned. We did something wrong. We're sorry. God, save us. But we don't see that here. So this is one, very clearly, it was left out. It's not an accident. When Esther's maidens and eunuchs came and informed her, the queen was greatly agitated. She sent clothing for Mordecai to wear so that he might take off his sackcloth, but he refused. Thereupon, Esther summoned Hathach, one of the eunuchs whom the king had appointed to serve her, and sent him to Mordecai to learn the why and wherefore of it all. Hathach went out to Mordecai in the city square in front of the palace gate. Mordecai told him all that had happened to him and about all the money that Haman had offered to pay to the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him the written text of the law that had been proclaimed in Shushan for their destruction. Bade him to show it to Esther and inform her and charge her to go to the king and appeal to him to plead with him for her people. All right, so Mordecai sends a message to Esther, save us. You're the queen, you can do something. When Hathach came and delivered Mordecai's message to Esther, Esther told Hathach to take back to Mordecai the following reply. All the king's courtiers and the people of the king's provinces know that if any person, man or woman, enters the king's presence in the inner court without having been summoned, there is but one law for him, that he be put to death. Only if the king extends a golden scepter to him may he live. Now, I have not been summoned to visit the king for the last 30 days. It was true that in order to prevent assassinations, people who were not invited couldn't come to see the Persian king. That's, only ones that he would invite. That doesn't mean he was going to necessarily make it, but it kept others away from it. So Esther says, what am I going to do? If I go to sing the king, I'll die maybe, unless the king, wants me. When Mordecai was told what Esther had said, Mordecai had this message delivered to Esther. Do not imagine that you, of all the Jews, will escape with your life by being in the king's palace. On the contrary, if you keep silent in this crisis, relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from another quarter, while you and your father's house would perish. And who knows, perhaps you have attained to royal position for just such a crisis. Mordecai says, don't count on being saved by being in the palace. Furthermore, if you don't help us, we'll get it from somewhere else, another quarter. Now, the word used here, it says, Yamod la Yehudim mi makom acher. They translated from another quarter. Makom, place, is also, by the rabbis said, was the name of God. So this is a one time there seems to be allusion, at least according to later rabbinic tradition, to God. So Mordecai says to Esther, God will save us, without saying God. And maybe this is the whole reason you got to be queen. All of this was set in motion so that you would be there when this took place. Esther sent back this answer to Mordecai. Go, assemble all the Jews who live in Shushan and fast in my behalf. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maidens will observe the same fast. Then I shall go to the king, though it is contrary to the law. And if I am to perish, I shall perish. So Mordecai went about the city and did just as Esther had commanded him. Okay, so Esther says, go fast for 3 days. That's quite a bit of fasting. And I will go to see the king. Now, the day before Purim, Thursday this year, we have what is called Ta'anit Esther, the fast of Esther. The day before Purim is a half fast from sunrise to sunset. In part commemoration of the fast of Esther, but it's not the same time that Esther did her fast. Okay, but that is perhaps part of the relationship to that tradition we have today. On the third day, Esther put on royal apparel and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, facing the king's palace, while the king was sitting on his royal throne in the throne room, facing the entrance of the palace. As soon as the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won his favor. The king extended to Esther the golden scepter which he had in his hand, and Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. What troubles you, Queen Esther? The king asked. And what is your request? Even to half the kingdom it shall be granted to you. He says, whatever you want, dear, I'll give it to you. I'll even give you half of my kingdom. He didn't really mean it, but he says, I'll give you anything, up to even half of my kingdom. So what does Esther say? Does she say, save the Jews? No, we see here what's going to take place is Haman has got influence in the court. He's second in command to the king. If she came out right away and said something, she might have played her cards too soon and might have failed. So what does Esther do? She has a little plot that she's got going. So she says, if it please your majesty, Esther replied, let your majesty and Haman come today to the feast that I have prepared for him. I invite you and Haman to come to lunch. The king commanded, tell Haman to hurry and do Esther's bidding. So the king and Haman came to the feast that Esther prepared. Okay, so, if I were the king, you might be, what's Haman got to do with this? All right. What has Haman got to do? All right. At the wine feast, the king asked Esther, what is your wish? It shall be granted you. What is your request? Even to half the kingdom, it should be fulfilled. My wish, replied Esther, my request, if your majesty will do me the favor, if it please your majesty to grant my wish and accede to my request, all these words of, subservience to the king. Let your majesty and Haman come to the feast which I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do your majesty's bidding. So Esther says to the king, come back again tomorrow. Bring Haman along. And then I'll tell you what I want. Okay, so again, she is delaying and somehow getting Haman mixed in this. And you got to think that the king is kind of wondering what's happening. So that day, Haman went out happy and lighthearted. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the palace gate, Mordecai did not rise or even stir on his account. Haman was filled with rage at him. Nevertheless, Haman controlled himself and went home. He sent for his friends and his wife Zeresh, and Haman told them about his great wealth and his many sons, and all about how the king had promoted him, advanced him above the other officials of the king's courtiers. You know, he's bragging about everything he's got. What is more, said Haman, Queen Esther gave a feast, and beside the king, she did not have anyone but me. And tomorrow, too, I'm invited by her along with the king. Yet all this means nothing to me. Every time I see that Jew Mordecai sitting in the palace gate, it all goes to nothing because of that stinky Jew. Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, let a stake be put up 50 cubits high. A cubit's about 18 inches. So we're talking about 75 feet high, 30, what is that, 30 meters? 75, anyway, you figure it out. 40 inches is in a meter. When his wife let a stake be put 50 cubits high, and in the morning asked the king to have Mordecai impaled on it. Then you can go gaily with the king to the feast. The proposal pleased Haman, and he had the stake put up. So Haman's happy. I'm going to the king. I'm going to be able to tell him, let's stick that Mordecai up on this stake, kill him and put him up there. And I'll be happy going to the feast with the queen and the king. All right. What's going to happen? Everybody's waiting with bated breath. That night, sleep deserted the king, and he ordered the book of records, the annals to be brought, and it was read to the king. Nothing more boring than reading about what all took place in the kingdom. But again, in any other book of the Bible, we would say God took away his sleep, or God wouldn't let him sleep, or God did something so that he wouldn't sleep and bring out the annals. But it doesn't say that. Again, it's the hidden hand of God, God behind it, not God up front. There was found written that Mordecai had denounced Bigtana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, who had plotted to do away with King Ahasuerus. So he read about this wonderful thing that Mordecai did. What honor or advancement has been conferred on Mordecai for this, the king inquired. Nothing at all has been done for him, replied the king's servants who were in attendance on him. All right, so Mordecai was not rewarded. Remember I said back then, it was an interesting thing. He didn't get his reward then. Now the king reads about it, so he wants to give him a reward. So, of course, kings would consult with people about giving rewards. So the king says, who is in the court? The king asked. For Haman had just entered the outer court of the royal palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai impaled on the stake he had prepared for him. Shows you this is carefully written. The king just decided he's got to honor and reward Mordecai. Haman walks into the outer chamber because he wants to ask the king to kill this Mordecai, who the king just now has said, I want to honor. So it is Haman, the king's servants answered. So let him enter, said the king. Haman entered, and the king asked him, what should be done for a man whom the king desires to honor? Now, to prove that this was written under divine inspiration, according to rabbinic tradition, we're told what Haman was thinking. The only way we can know what Haman was thinking was if God told Mordecai and Esther what he was thinking. So that's one of the rabbinic traditions here. So Haman said to himself, whom would the king desire to honor more than me? He says, wait a minute. The king's asking me how to honor somebody, but who would he want to honor more than he would want to honor me? Because I'm second to the king. I'm this great guy. He must be talking about me, but he's asking me obliquely, what would I like? So Haman said to the king, for the man whom the king desires to honor, let royal garb which the king has worn be brought, and on a horse on which the king is ridden, and on whose head a royal diadem has been set. And let the attire and the horse be put in charge of one of the king's noble courtiers. and let the man whom the king desires to honor be attired and paraded on the horse through the city square while they proclaim before him, this is what is done for the man whom the king desires to honor. Okay, says Haman says, that sounds like a good deal. So I want this for me. Quick, then said the king to Haman, get the garb and the horse, as you have said, and do this to Mordecai, the Jew, who sits in the king's gate. Omit nothing of which you have proposed. Here's Haman, wants to get rid of Mordecai, proposes this great honor that he thinks he's going to get, and he's told by the king, go do this to Mordecai. So Haman took the garb and the horse and arrayed Mordecai and paraded him through the city square, and he proclaimed before him, this is what is done for the man whom the king desires to honor. Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate while Haman hurried home, his head covered in mourning. Now the rabbis, again, playing on this whole story, say it was found out that Haman was going to have be honored. She thought her father is going to be honored, and she thought that Mordecai would be the one leading the horse. So she went on top of their house and had a what do you call it? Night bucket, whatever, you know what I'm talking about. And when Mordecai and Haman came by, she, thinking it was Mordecai leading the horse, dumped all of the garbage that was in the bucket onto
The basin.
what?
The basin, right?
Not basin. What's another word for it? I forget.
Besides the point. Sorry.
Chamber pot. Chamber pot. Okay. And you know it's in a chamber pot. Okay, so she pours on. She thinks it's Mordecai's head, but who is it? It's her father. She's so ashamed. She throws herself off the house, the roof of the house. And that's why, another reason why Haman, he's all covered in feces and he's mourning the death of his daughter. And he walks into the house like this. There, Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had befallen him. His advisors and his wife Zeresh said to him, now, what would you do if your husband, your lover, your good friend comes in all upset and everything? Of course, you're going to try and comfort him, right? Wouldn't you do that? So what do they say to him? Don't worry. No. If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish stock, you will not overcome him. You will fall before him to your ruin. Okay, so they say you're in bad luck. While they were still speaking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurriedly brought Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. So now Haman had gone to see the king, thinking he would get rid of Mordecai, then he would be happy going to the king's feast. Instead, he's just been embarrassed because he's had to lead Mordecai through the town and proclaiming Mordecai this wonderful guy, and now he's going to go to the banquet. So the king and Haman came to feast with Queen Esther. On the second day, the king again asked Esther at the wine feast, what is your wish, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to half the kingdom, it shall be fulfilled. Queen Esther replied, if your majesty will do me the favor, and if it please your majesty, let my life be granted me as my wish, and my people as my request. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, massacred, and exterminated. Had we only been sold as bondmen and bondswomen, I would have kept silent, for the adversary is not worthy of the king's trouble. She says, look, I wouldn't have bothered you if they only sold us as slaves. But dear honey, they want to kill us. They want to kill me. Whereupon the king Ahasuerus demanded of Queen Esther, me who's Abiezer, who is this guy who wants to dare to do this? The adversary and the enemy, replied Esther, is this evil Haman. Okay, so Haman's sitting there next to the king, and Haman cringed in terror before the king and the queen. The king in his fury left the wine feast for the palace garden while Haman remained to plead with Queen Esther for his life. All right, the king walks out, he's fuming, and Haman's begging Esther, for he saw that the king had resolved to destroy him. When the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was lying prostrate on the couch on which Esther reclined. You know, they had these couches that you would sit on, lay on to eat your meals. Haman is stretched out at her feet, as it were, on the couch, begging for his life. But what does the king say when he sees this? Does he mean the king, cried the king, to ravish the queen in my own palace? What's he doing now? He's going after my wife? Attacking my wife? No sooner did these words leave the king's lips than Haman's face was covered. The Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, what is more, you know, when you see the guy going down, everybody now becomes friends of the guy who's gone his way up. What is more, a stake is standing in Haman's house 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, the man whose word saved the king. Impale him on it, the king ordered. So they impaled Haman on the stake which he had put up for Mordecai, and the king's fury abated. Okay? But the problem is, all right, we'll go on. The very next day, Achashverosh gave the property of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, to the queen Esther. Mordecai presented himself to the king, for Esther revealed how he was related to her. The king slipped off his ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther put Mordecai in charge of Haman's property. So Mordecai is a big shot now. But remember, the king had an edict that all the Jews are to be destroyed. Esther spoke to the king again, falling at his feet and weeping, beseeching him to avert the evil plotted by Haman the Agagite against the Jews. The king extended the royal scepter to Esther, and Esther arose and stood before the king. If it please your majesty, she said, and if I won your favor and the proposal seem right to your majesty, if I'm pleasing to you, let dispatches be written countermanding those which were written by Haman, et cetera, et cetera. Countermand the order. He says, can't do it. Once an order has been given, and I've given you what I can, I give Mordecai Haman's property, but you know what you can do? Right, that the Jews can defend themselves. And it's getting late, so I'll just finish up with this. So they defend themselves, they fight, and after the 13th of Adar, everywhere else, the Jews have a feast. In Shushan, it takes another day to finish the fighting. And so they celebrated, finished on the 14th and celebrated on the 15th. So at the end of chapter 9, towards the end of chapter 9, Queen Esther, the daughter of Avichail, wrote a second letter of Purim for the purpose of confirming with full authority the aforementioned one of Mordecai the Jew. Dispatches were sent to all the Jews in the 127 provinces around Achashverosh with an ordinance of equity and honesty. These days of Purim shall be observed at their proper time, as Mordecai the Jew and now Queen Esther has obligated them to do. And just as they assumed for themselves and their descendants the obligation of the fast with their lamentations. And this was put in a scroll. I missed the paragraph that I wanted. Yeah, a little bit earlier, in view then of all the instruction in the said letter and what the experience of the matter, they follow them, the Jews undertook and irrevocably obligated themselves and their descendants, and all might join them, to observe these 2 days in the manner prescribed at the proper time each year. Consequently, these days are recalled and observed in every generation, by every family, every province, and every city, and they should never cease amongst the Jews, etc. All right, so that's the basis of, here it is. Earlier, Mordecai sends a letter about the 14th and 15th. They were to observe them as days of feasting and merrymaking, and as an occasion for sending gifts to one another and presents to the poor. Okay, so that's where we find it. Now, one of the things the rabbi said, since the Jews undertook to observe all of these things, they said, I'll finish with this. There's a famous midrash that says when the Jews were gathered around Mount Sinai to receive the Torah, God lifted up Mount Sinai over their heads and said, if you accept my Torah, fine. If not, I'm going to drop the mountain and this will be your grave. So, yeah, of course we'll accept it. That's our choice. So the Jews could claim we were stuck with it. We didn't want the Torah. We were stuck with it. We were threatened with it. So when the Jews during the time of Mordecai and Esther said everything we were do and obey, they were referring to the entire Torah. not because God was threatening them, but because they accepted upon themselves to live with it. And so one of the rabbinic traditions is the book of Esther is the second acceptance of the Torah, this time without any kind of threat towards them. And that's another reason the rabbis put it in there. Okay, so that's it for tonight. We have, God willing, next week, and we won't have internet problems. And if I recall correctly, March 3rd is when we have our second exam. By the way, if you didn't send in if you owe money for the classes, please take care of that. All right. Any questions? Anything to be brought up?
No.
All right. Because of the reality of the pandemic, there are going to be Megillah readings online. I'm sure you can find them in various places. And this year you have to do it that way, and make God willing next year you can go to the shul and have it the proper way. Okay. So good night, everybody. Have a good one, and we'll see each other next week.
Take care, Rabbi.
Bye.
No, have a good night.
Night.
Good night.